Good afternoon. I've only got 7 minutes, so I'm going to have to go through this pretty quickly. Normally, I like to spend about half an hour telling people my story because it is quite a long story, but I'll try and cram it in. We're going to have an opportunity to do a question and answer session a bit later on, so hopefully anything you haven't heard now, you'll be able to ask me then. Let me go right back to the beginning because that's really important for you to understand my brand and how the whole thing came about. I was actually born in Jamaica, and I was born in a place called Frankville, Clarendon. And for those of you who don't know the island, it's very, very rural. So if you went there today, you see quite a lot of subsistence farmers actually working the land. And I've always felt that farming was very, very much part of my DNA, as it were. But for those of you who know your history knows that in the 50s, people like my parents had an opportunity to come to this country and work, and it just happened that they found work in the cities. And I was actually brought up in a place called Small Heath in Birmingham. And for any of you who know Small Heath in Birmingham, you'll know what a shithole the place is, basically. So I was brought up in one of those classic inner city areas that was devoid of hope, opportunity, and I tell you what, it really stays with you to be brought up in an area like that where there isn't much opportunity. So one of the things I try and do is to try and encourage young people that there is things that they can do to improve their lives. I'm from a family of 11, so you could imagine the scene. In this area, 11 of us living in this classic two-up, two-down terrace house, so you can imagine it was extremely cramped. And my father had an allotment as a way of subsidizing the family income. And it was my job as the oldest boy to look after this allotment. And I absolutely loved being on this allotment. It was like, it was my oasis away from the misery that I was surrounded by. Now, this bit is very, very important. It's really important. Is that I could remember at the age of 11, only 11 years old, I made myself a promise that one day I would like to own my own farm. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but it was a promise that I'd lodged into the back of my mind, and everything that I subsequently did was to try and get into a position to own this farm. And what I say when I go around the country doing talks like this, especially to young people, the most important thing in setting up a business is to have the courage to dream and to have a vision. And I'm always surprised of a lot of people who are thinking about going into business who don't even have that. Fundamentally important to have the courage to have a vision and a dream. I went to the local secondary modern schools, as they were called then, and this school was as much of a dump as the place that I was living in. Teachers hated being there, the kids hated being there. It's a pretty miserable place. So I left school at 16 without any qualifications at all. I could hardly read and write, and my headmaster thought that I was the sort of person that would probably end up in prison like a lot of my schoolmates did. But as a way of getting away from home, I joined the army. And there's one thing that I learned in life is that personalities like me should not join the army. So being a black man didn't go down well at all. So after about a year, them trying to lick me into shape, I got kicked out of the army, so I have a dishonorable discharge to my name. And what is really interesting is that when you've been a failure at everything, there's only one thing that in those days, and it might be the case now, there was only one thing that was then left available to you. And believe it or not, that was catering. And I went to the local catering college where I studied to be a chef, and luckily I really loved it and enjoyed doing that. And I worked in a variety of restaurants and hotels before chefing was a glamorous profession. And as much as I loved it, what was really interesting, the promise that I'd made to myself was always there nagging away at me. So I knew I had to do something else to try and get enough money to be able to buy my farm. And at that time, there used to be a really popular documentary series on called 40 Minutes that made social documentaries. And I said, actually, I would love to go and work in television. All of my family and friends looked at me and thought I was mad because A, I could hardly read and write, B, television was very much the place for the Oxbridge types. But I could remember something that my father said to me, and I've tried to live my life by these two pieces of advice, which is that actually it doesn't matter on your qualifications and what background you're from. You only need two things to achieve whatever you want, especially in business, just two things. And the first thing, as most of you will know, is absolute ruthless focus. You have to be absolutely focused. And anybody who's successful, they will be extremely focused. And then the other thing is to have a positive attitude. Because if you have a positive attitude, things come your way. So taking those pieces of advice, I could remember, and this is true, I got a copy of the Radio Times and I wrote to every single producer in the Radio Times, and not one of the little bastards got back to me. They didn't bother writing to me. Not only did they not write back to me, I also decided I was going to ring them. They wouldn't take my calls. Anybody who worked in television, I did everything I possibly could to befriend that person. And eventually it paid off. And I can remember it was a woman, and women actually, men, can I just say something? It's like they're the greatest people around to give opportunity. They're far more entrepreneurial in giving opportunities than men generally. So I know that might sound prejudiced, but I'm saying it. They were bloody wonderful. And this woman, she introduced me to a head guy at BBC Pebble Mill, and he talked to me for about an hour. And after an hour, he says, look, you're not the sort of person that we tend to employ in television because A, you got a bit of an attitude problem, and B, that you just don't have the sort of qualifications. But he said, I will take a chance with you. I'll give you a 3-month contract as a runner and to see what happens then. And that man having the courage to give me that opportunity, that was a very entrepreneurial thing for him to have done. And all too often, when we talk about entrepreneurialism, we tend to look at all the great stars and not recognize that actually you can be entrepreneurial in tons and tons of different ways. Some of you may not run your own businesses here, but it doesn't stop you from being entrepreneurial. And what I say about entrepreneurialism, it's a bit like falling in love. Do you remember that moment you had that little flutter? If you have that little flutter, you know you're doing something entrepreneurial because you're not too sure, but you're going to go with it anyhow. And that opportunity meant that I started off as a runner, I went on to be a researcher, then I went on to be a producer, director, and I traveled the world making films about food and drink. A lot of the celebrity chefs that red light's flashing away like mad, but I'm going to continue. A lot of the celebrity chefs that I brought to television, I'm responsible for. Anyhow, I worked in their television for a very long time. And then I left TV because I still wanted to buy my farm. And I decided that the only way I was going to do that was to set up my own marketing agency. And I can remember when I had to decide to leave the BBC to set up my own business. And what I recognize when a lot of people who want to set up their own business is that they want to do it, and the one thing that prevents them is fear. Fear of what will happen if it goes wrong. And I know that there's only one antidote to fear, only one antidote, and that is passion. You have to be extremely passionate about what you're going to do, especially in the early days, for it to sort of work out. And with that, I decided that I will set up my marketing agency, which I did, and it was extremely successful, and then that gave me the money to buy my farm. It took me 20 years from the moment that I had that dream to get in the position of buying my farm. I bought my farm down in Launceston, or Lanston, as they say, I should pronounce it. And when I bought my farm, it was at the time when a lot of dairy farmers were getting out of farming because they couldn't hack it anymore. And what I saw down there really surprised me. I saw that a lot of farmers had really lost the relationship with the consumer, that actually it was the supermarkets that now dominated in this relationship. And I saw that there was an opportunity. The sort of things that I used to find extremely frustrating is that one of the fastest growing brands at the time was a brand called the Fair Trade brand. And the whole premise behind the Fair Trade brand is you, the consumer, buy into that proposition, knowing that that money is going to help people in developing countries, which is great. Everybody admires that. But to try and get the British consumer to feel the same about their own British farmers, they just didn't. And I just thought that was wrong. So I decided that I would actually develop a brand that was going to really challenge the whole concept of what a farmer was all about. And I spent a lot of money researching. I decided that I was going to do a fresh food product, i.e. a sausage. I decided I was going to do a sausage that was going to be gluten-free. And I did all the research, and then it came to, well, what am I going to call this brand? And I was scratching my head thinking, what I'm going to call it. And then it came to me one day. All of my next-door neighbors used to call me the Black Farmer. And I thought, well, shit, you know, that's a pretty good brand name. Not only is it a really good brand name, but there's no one else out there that could nick the idea. Not only could they not nick the idea, but it has jeopardy. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting, especially for those of us who are marketeers, is that word jeopardy. And what I mean by jeopardy is if you're reading a great book or you're watching a great film, the thing that really keeps you stimulated to keep reading or watching is what's going to happen next. So you can imagine there's a shitload of jeopardy in a brand called the Black Farmer, because people are not too sure about, well, is it politically correct? Can he say that? Can he? And that is what you actually need to do in the early days of setting up a business, is that how do you grab people's attention so they're going to want to try and find out more to get to the place where they're going to actually try the product. Anyhow, I had called it the Black Farmer. I tried to get all the supermarkets to try and list them. They all said no. And the thing that I recognized was this, is that the only people that the supermarkets fear are the consumers. So I decided when they all said no, is that I built a website, and it's still there today, that had the names of all the buyers, their telephone numbers, their address, and then I went around the country and I did a massive sampling program. And I say to people who love the sausages, I said, look, if you really love the sausages, I just need you to do me one simple favor. Just go onto my website and ask the buyers and demand from the buyers, why aren't they listing my products? And as God is my witness, that's how I got my listings. Because I absolutely understood that the most powerful people around are the consumer. And if you look after the consumer, they really do look after you and defend you, especially in the sort of modern age we have of social networking. Listen, I'm going to stop this, I'm going to get in trouble, but it would be nice to sort of talk a bit more a bit later on. Nice to talk to you, okay?